My father was an operator for the MBTA for the duration of my childhood. Affectionately named the T, the Boston subway system was the first in the United States. Built in 1897, the subway boasted a collection of careening tunnels and colorful trolley cars. Of course, it certainly had its issues. Well, if I'm being honest, it had a lot of issues. Subway cars were routinely going out of order. Paint was chipping along the walls, and the seats were worn down to the bone, often poking you in the ass at uncomfortable angles. The subway tracks always seemed to require massive amounts of maintenance that left commuters staring at their watches blindly, hoping that the delay wouldn't be that long. More often than not, trains would often whiz by passengers still waiting on the platform, their angry shouts lost in the rush of the train and the dark concrete tunnels that threatened to eclipse them. But despite all of these flaws, the T was my home, especially after my mother left. I came home from school to find her clothes missing, her pink polka dot umbrella gone, and her car locked and dark. At first, in a naive and childlike way, I thought she was just late getting home from the dry cleaners. Maybe she had decided to take the train that day, or maybe the bus. She never did like to drive in the rain. It seemed like the only possible explanation while my mother and her clothes were gone. But then my childish trust dissipated when I noticed the picture frames. Every single picture in our house was torn out of the frame, leaving little pieces of photographs still stuck in the edges. And by the time my dad had come home, she was already long gone, leaving us bewildered and anxiously alone. From then on, it was just me, my dad, and the rickety subway trains. Without my mom to stay home and watch me after school, my dad had me ride along with him on his trips. The $2.75 entrance fee was cheaper than any babysitter my dad could even find. Plus, it gave us some bonding time, as he would put it. And to be honest, I didn't mind riding the trains on his route every day after school. I would curl up with a good book on one of the seats and watch as the passengers fluttered through each day. I would make sure to sit up in front so I had a clear view of my dad and the tunnels. I was a lonely kid back then, sort of out of place, out of sorts. So riding the T each day gave me some semblance of normality. I would pretend that the daily commuters were my friends. I got to know Cheryl, the working mother of 3 who carried a lip gloss in her baby bag. And then there was Frank, the pudgy banker who loved horror podcasts. And of course there was Kate, the girl with the sad smile and a book always in hand. And Stan, the man who couldn't keep his eyes off of her. The T was my home. I like watching the light flicker between the shadows of the concrete, the trolley car moving swift and eager down the path. There is something calming about the noise of the train and its passengers. It offset the deep silence that had settled on our floorboards since Mom had left us. And now, do you really want to go with me tonight? My dad asked as he pulled on his MBTA jacket. His voice was tired, strained. It was his 3rd shift of the week and the fatigue hung around his neck like an ill-fitted tie. Well, I don't want to be left here, I mumbled. It was the summer vacation before 7th grade, and I was bored, listless and lazy from the spike in temperature and the humidity. Riding along with my dad in the air-conditioned subway car sounded a hell of a lot more entertaining than sitting on my worn-out couch with a fan blowing hot air in my face. Well, this is a late one, kiddo, he said. You know the trains don't stop until 1:30 in the morning. In New York City, they never stop, I chimed. And that's why the Big Apple is a big pile of shit. He chuckled to himself, leaning down to put on his shoes. Mom said we shouldn't curse, you know, I replied reflexively. The room changed and the air became thick. I crossed the invisible line we drew the day after Mom had left, never ever to talk about her. My dad paused for a moment, his cheeks flushing red, and then he finished tying up his shoes with shaky, uneven fingers. He snuck a glance at the picture frames on the hallway wall. They were empty. They had been for a year. A year to this day, actually. Which is the real reason that I didn't want to be left here alone. I couldn't stand the memories of me huddled in the corner, watching the light shift to darkness as my stomach growled and my shoulders shook with sobs. Here we go. I was left alone. I didn't want to be left alone again. I'm sorry, I stuttered. He shook his head quickly, robotically. He tore his eyes away from the dusty frames. Well, we better get moving then if you're coming with me, he said, his voice flat. Embarrassed and eager to please, I bolted upright from the couch and I joined him at his side. He gave me a small pat on the head and we were on our way, under the concrete of Boston. The trains were quiet that night. Usually on these late runs we get a lot of drunk college kids heading home from the bars or sports fans heading out to a game. But tonight was peaceful, almost still even. The college kids were back to whatever town they originally came from, and the Red Sox weren't playing that night. My dad said that the heat probably kept everybody else inside, glued to their TVs and their electric fans. I didn't mind. I liked when the train was empty. We shifted slowly through the tunnels, pausing every now and then at a stop to see if any passengers would get on. When none would, my dad would shake his head and close up the doors, and propel us to the next stop. After a few hours of this, I looked up from my book to see my dad gripping the controls tightly, his knuckles wide. I stopped for a yawn. Dad, what time is it? 9:13, he answered. I paused. But didn't your shift start at 9 tonight? He was silent, his grip on the controls narrowing. Okay, very funny, I chuckled. But what time is it really? 9:13. But we've been on the tracks forever. It has to be at least midnight by now. He didn't answer. I sighed irritably at my dad's weird joke and I took out my cell phone. Usually, service wasn't the best down here, but at least it was good at keeping track of the time. I flipped it open and I stared at the screen. 9:13 p.m., just like my dad had said. My back stiffened. When was the last time we even picked up a rider anyway? I peered out the window as we pulled into the next stop. The tea station at Bullstone Street was the same as it always had been. A concrete floor, concrete ceilings, green pillars to mark that we were on the green line. But there was something off. I just couldn't put my finger on it. My dad was shaking as he opened the trolley doors. It was then that I noticed what was off about the stop. It was the people. They marched in blurry, disfigured lines that didn't seem to have shape at all. Instead, they looked like one large moving mass filtering across the platform and up the stairs, as if time had sped up on them. Dad! My breath was caught in my throat as I rose from my seat, my book falling limply to the floor. I crossed the span of the train in 2 steps, pausing right before the open door. A buzzing filled my ears, a gentle drum of murmuring and laughter, a warm, bright laughter. I gripped one of the poles and I leaned closer to the door, the balls of my feet tipping further. I wanted to see them, be closer to them, be closer to that strange, blurry mass of light. Don't get off the train, my dad hissed, his sudden words anchoring me to the floor. Dad, what's going on? I couldn't tear my eyes away from the enchanting blur of passengers outside of the train window, rhythmic, beating, and marching. I'll tell you later. Don't move. Don't get off the train. My dad closed the train doors and the trolley jerked ahead along the track with a screech. I clutched the pole firmly, nearly losing my footing with the sudden movement. The blurred passengers disappeared between the concrete and the darkness of the tunnel. I felt myself let out a sigh of relief. I didn't even realize how fast my heart was racing. Just then, the lights flickered in the trolley, plunging us into darkness. Dad! I choked, tears burning in my eye. His arm shot out from the conductor's seat and he grabbed me, pulling me close. He was shaking but trying to comfort me at the same time. I think it only worsened my fear, to see a man that I thought was so brave begin to crumble. Shh, my birdie, it's gonna be fine, he whispered as the train continued to move forward. Birdie was the nickname he used to call me when I was younger. Hearing it now in the darkness of the tunnels, it helped calm my frayed nerves. Drying my tears, I broke free from his hold. You have to tell me what's going on. I couldn't see his face in the darkness, but I could sense it stiffen. It's been like this for 3 hours, he whispered. I thought if I just kept moving, just kept the train going, he wouldn't come. Who wouldn't come? Suddenly the lights flickered back on and the train was bathed in a strange blue glow. I looked towards my dad and I could see, for the first time in my life, how very breakable he was. Tears ran like rivers down his cheeks, pooling on his uniform. They left heavy splotches like polka dots. The conductor. Who's the... The train lurched to a sudden stop, causing me to slam against the front of the trolley, bumping my shoulder against the controls. I cried out in pain and my dad instinctively put a hand over my mouth to keep me from crying any louder. Birdie, you have to be quiet now, he whispered. You can't let him hear you. Let who? The train was suddenly illuminated by the pale blue glow that was emanating from the trolley. I could now see the familiar concrete, the rusty and worn track that had carried me home day after day. But there was now something unfamiliar standing in the middle of the track, blocking our way home. The figure stood tall. Even from my position in the trolley, I could tell that this man was not normal sized. He had to be at least 9 feet tall. His body was pale and thin, almost skeletal even, with his elbows and knees pointing out painfully from his crisp, clean conductor's uniform. But the uniform wasn't like the one my dad was wearing. No, instead it seemed dated, as if from an earlier decade, a decade almost forgotten. The figure began to move towards us in a brisk, uneven pace. I gripped my dad's arm so tight that I could have drawn blood if not for his jacket. Dad, I whispered. Shh, we have to let him on. Let him on, I nearly hissed. We can't let him on. The figure now stood outside of the front door. His body hunched over so he could see through the windows. His face stared back, pale and ghastly. His unusually long fingers tapped against the window pane lightly in a rhythmic beat of 3. Now that he was closer, I could make out his pale yellow eyes sunk deep into his eye sockets. He grinned then, flashing a smile of crooked, sharp teeth. Go back to your seat, my dad sputtered. Transfixed, I backed my way to my seat, keeping my eyes on the conductor the entire time. My dad wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve and pulled the lever to let the door open. It creaked open and the figure entered, bringing with him a feeling of dread, death, and the smell of rotten meat. Welcome aboard, miss, the conductor said to me. I shuddered. His voice was dusty and dated, like the concrete above our heads. He tipped his hat with long, pale fingers and he smiled at me. I started to cry silently. The conductor turned his gaze away from me and approached my father at the front of the train. I'll take the controls now, sir, he demanded. For a second, I thought my dad would protest, balk at this strange figure's request. But instead, my father limply climbed out of his seat, his legs wobbling as he passed the conductor. The conductor smiled at him and tipped his hat as he climbed awkwardly into the driver's seat. His arms and legs were too long to fit properly, so they jutted out around the controls. His posture reminded me of a sickly spider. My dad sat down next to me, placing his arm over me protectively. What's going on? I whispered hastily. Where will he take us? To hell, my dear, the conductor answered back. He laughed shrilly, almost robotically, as he pulled the trolley into gear and we began speeding along the track. The eerie blue light faded and now we were thrown into darkness, barreling through the tunnels at a seemingly impossible speed. My dad pulled me close to him and I sobbed. You have to stay quiet, Birdie. I promise we'll be okay. Just don't answer him, or anybody else who steps on this trolley. You just have to stay quiet. That's very, very important. Don't utter a word to any other passenger. They aren't who they say they are. I shook my head, my tears falling rapidly in the dark. He cupped my cheek firmly, something he hadn't done since I was younger. Promise me you don't say a word. I nodded numbly and he let go of my cheek, pulling me back into him. Suddenly, the train stopped, causing us both to fall forward onto the floor. The train now glowed a dark, deep red that cast shadows through the rest of the track. My dad grunted as he pulled himself up, helping me back into my seat as well. "All aboard," the conductor shouted. I looked at my dad questioningly, but he put his finger up to his lips, signaling me to be quiet as well. The doors opened to an empty tea station, slick and wet, and in horror, I realized that the floor of the tea station was covered in blood. It dripped from the ceiling like rain, coating the floor in gore. She appeared then, under a pink polka dot umbrella. She was wearing a yellow dress and carrying a worn, tattered suitcase. My heart beat quickly in my chest. There was something so familiar about her, and yet so off. Her movements were jerky as she walked towards the train, her umbrella blocking her face. My dad suddenly gripped my arm tightly, panic widening in his eyes. He recognized her. Then, as she got closer, I did too. It was Mom. She smiled as she got to the train steps. The blood rain pelted her umbrella, sliding off in thick droplets. "Birdie, you found me," she cooed. I opened my mouth to respond, but my dad quickly covered it with his hand, silencing me. She tilted her head, turning her focus from me to him. "Tom, you always were a coward, weren't you?" Her tone was slick with malice. She laughed. "All aboard!" The conductor roared again. She smiled then, flashing her bright white teeth, and stepped onto the trolley. She sat down across from us and smoothed out her skirt. She cocked her head, inspecting us. The train roared to life when we pulled away from the station, leaving the dripping rain behind us. My father's palm was pressed firmly against my mouth, dissuading me from speaking. But even if it weren't, I wouldn't know what to say. Fear had stolen my tongue. My mother sat unnaturally still, almost unaffected by the chaotic sway of the train. She closed the umbrella and laid it on the floor at her feet next to her tattered suitcase. I noticed edges of paper sticking out from the sides. They looked like photographs. "You've grown so much," she cooed, staring at me. "I always knew you would sprout up, just like your mama." My dad's palm pressed down harder on my mouth, almost painful. I wanted so badly to rip his hand away and scream at her, tell her that she could have witnessed me grow up herself if she had stayed. But instead, I cried silently, weeping and folding into myself. My mother's eyes lit up. "Oh, you still love me, don't you? That's so pathetic." I felt her disapproval jab me in the chest. "I don't love you. I never did." I fought hard to shake my dad's hand away from his mouth, but he only pressed further, hugging me to his chest at the same time. I felt his tears fall on the crown of my head. "It was a blessing, you know, when I laughed," she continued, her eyes watching mine carefully. She licked her lips. "Your whiny father was the one who wanted you anyway. Me, I wanted nothing to do with you. When I saw the positive pregnancy test, I cried. I cried for days. You were a curse." "No," she chuckled. "More than a curse. You were a parasite. A pathetic leech who sucked up my beauty, my strength." She stood suddenly now, her yellow dress flowing gently. "But I'm much stronger now. When you were born, I thought I would kill you. It would have been so easy too, my birdie. I would have just pressed a pillow against your lips and ended your life before it even began. As easy as breaking a bird's beak. Or so weak and needy. It disgusted me. You disgust me." She inched closer, her eyes glowing. "No mother would ever want you. You're a revolting waste of..." "Stop it!" My father suddenly screamed. He jumped up out of his seat to face my mother, their faces inches apart. She smiled and curled into him, putting her hand on the back of his neck. Despite himself, he leaned into her caress, forgetting, just for a moment, that she wasn't who she said she was. "Oh, Tom," she cooed, her eyes blinking up at him. "I'm so glad you finally said something." Mary. He smiled at her touch, wrapping his arm around her waist. Her eyes glazed over him, turning the same shade of yellow as my mother's dress. My dad started to shake then, his skin burning at her touch, turning rotten and black. He tried to yank himself from her, but she held on with more resolve than her slight stature seemed to give away. She smiled as she kissed his lips. Good thing you're so weak, Tom. Now, you can be our passenger forever. She wound her tongue into his mouth, gripping his head with her hands. Her fingernails punctured his skull, burning the skin around his wounds. He screamed an ear-splitting scream that only seemed to drive my mother into a hysterical frenzy. The conductor laughed too, throwing the trolley further and further into the tunnels. I curled up into a ball on the trolley floor, holding my hand against my mouth so I wouldn't cry out. My father's skin burned and bled, shedding around my ankles. My mother just laughed harder. Speak, Bertie, speak. Speak, Bertie, speak. Please speak to me, Bertie. I miss you. Speak, oh godchild, speak. I felt myself stir under a pair of shaking hands. Lordy, child. My skin felt tight and my head ached, my tongue full of pins and needles. I wanted to tell the voice to go away, to leave me alone. I wanted to fall back asleep, back to the darkness where my father's bones lay. My father. I blinked my eyes open to a bright fluorescent light. BP monitors alerted to me the fact that I was in a hospital. She's awake. Oh, Susie, I was so worried. I focused my gaze on the woman in front of me. As she slowly came into view, I recognized it was Marge. I immediately began crying. Marge was my father's colleague, competent and my routine babysitter. She worked as a conductor for the past 40 years and was constantly referred to as Grandma T. She'd always chuckle when she would see me ride along with my father, telling him that one day I would be a little conductor myself. Marge told me that there was a gas leak in one of the tunnels. She said it caused an explosion and I had made it out alive. My dad didn't. They were still trying to locate his body, but an entire tunnel had collapsed, making the search and rescue mission impossible. They said that we should have never been in that tunnel to begin with. It had been out of commission for nearly 50 years. Once I was checked out by the endless array of doctors and seemed healthy enough to leave, it was then that Margie had told me the truth. We were sitting in the kitchen, a cold cup of tea lying untouched at my fingertips, when she asked me, "He came, didn't he? The conductor?" I couldn't find my voice to answer her. I just nodded numbly. She shuddered and wrapped her arms around me. "He comes sometimes, to drive you to hell. It happened to me once before." "He came for you?" "He comes for everyone, child," she whispered. "There are things in those tunnels that I can't explain. No one can, not even God himself. But you lived, you made it out." I was suddenly angry with her. Angry with my mother, angry with my father, angry with those damn tunnels that left me so alone and broken. "When the devil comes, you don't answer him," Marge had said solemnly. "You don't give him your tongue." Your father had given him his. The conductor shows you the most twisted version of what you want most, what you need most. Sometimes, she sighed heavily. Sometimes I guess people take the bait, like Eve took that damn apple. I didn't have any words left to say, and Marge didn't either. We sat in silence for the rest of the evening and for most of my childhood, what was left of it. She took me until I left for college. She was so proud of me when I was announced that I wanted to be a civil engineer. I wanted to learn how to plan cities, roadways, and subway tunnels. In a way, throwing myself into studying what made a city run helped me push back the memories of that night underground. I tried to rationalize what I saw. I told myself the same line the doctors gave me. It was a gas leak. It simply had to be. It accounted for my fuzzy memories and hallucinations. It wasn't the devil that I saw dressed in a conductor's uniform. It was just a gas-induced hallucination of my father driving down the wrong track. I told myself that. I told myself that for a while. Until today, when I was asked to inspect an old tunnel the city of Boston wanted me and my team to reinforce for the new Green Line expansion northwest of the city. I was the last one left in the crumbling tunnel. I was gathering up my things when I saw a yellow flash from the corner of my eye. I looked up to see my father smiling, waving at me behind a pillar. He was wearing a conductor's uniform. "All aboard, Birdie."